Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm over from ASU West, so it's just kind of up the road, and some of you may end up taking philosophy classes over there, so you can look me up. And I'm going to talk about the same thing, Euthyphro Dilemma. Let me give a little bit of context to the Euthyphro Dilemma. What's happening in this? You can Google this. MIT has a website that has all these classical texts there for free, so you can look this up and you can read it. It's very entertaining. I encourage you to do so. Socrates is waiting to go on trial. He's a philosopher, and he's committed some offenses against the state. Can you imagine philosophers doing that? When you think of philosopher, do you think of federal criminal? So he's waiting for his trial to begin, and there's another guy in the waiting room also waiting for a trial to begin, and so Socrates starts up a conversation with him. And this other guy, Euthyphro, is there because he's bringing his father to justice. And this raises a question, what are the demands of justice? Does filial piety, does love of your father trump the civil law? Would you bring your father to court, or would you protect your father? Which one's the higher of the two demands on our virtues? So that's the context. They're talking about this, and Socrates is interested in Euthyphro because he says he's very pious. He says it himself. That's something I don't hear a lot of students bragging about anymore. I listen as I go around campus and listen to what they brag about. They don't often brag about being pious. Do you know what piety is? Yeah? Well, that's what Socrates asks. Well, what is pious? He's very proud of being pious. What is piety? How do you know if you're pious or not? So the discussion that happens, as in many cases with Socrates, is that a number of the speaker's intuitions come out in the discussion. And so this discussion, that the dilemma that Peter and Mike put out there, for Socrates and Euthyphro, is a dilemma that comes up in the context of polytheism. So I'm going to suggest, I have 5 points. My first point is that this dilemma depends on the context you're operating within, your worldview context and your presuppositions. For these two, they're polytheists, and so they quickly get into a problem of what God do you follow? The gods disagree. The gods argue. Hera and Zeus are on different sides of the Trojan War. So if they disagree about what is good, how do you know which of them is superior? So polytheism will give you one part of the problem. Then there is dualism. Mike was talking about Plato, and Plato and Aristotle, Plato's Socrates' student, these are Greek dualists. They aren't polytheists. They believe that God and the material world have coexisted from eternity. They're both eternal. They deny the idea of God, the creator. And then there are theists, those who, like Thomas Jefferson, Christians, Judaism, Christianity, Islam are theistic religions who affirm God, the creator. The material world has not existed co-eternally with God. So the first point is just that when we enter into this discussion, as you're listening to people talk about it, you need to try to figure out which of these worldviews are they operating within. Because our intuitions are shaped by our presuppositions. So for Socrates and Euthyphro, they have very naturally intuitions that have to do with polytheism. And they naturally start discussing what Zeus did to his father. Zeus did not show filial piety to his father. And so Euthyphro says, I don't need to show that to my father on the model of Zeus. So their intuitions come out in that context. The second point is that the particular problem for them within polytheism is, as Mike said, it reduces the good to an appetite. What do you approve of? A desire. Zeus desires one thing, Hera desires something else, Apollos desires a third thing. And so you get into this problem of, is something good because I desire it, or do I desire it because it's good? Socrates uses the analogy of getting carried. Is something getting carried, or is it being carried because it gets carried? And how do we think about the action of these kinds of verbs? But again, in the context of the finite deities they're talking about, it depends on their circumstances and what they want and desire. So a particular problem, can we reduce good to an appetite or a desire? Sometimes it's called emotivism. Alternatives are intellectualism, which is the good has to do with believing true things about the world, or voluntarism, that the good has to do with the will. Usually one of these three will find intellect, emotion, or will trying to be what I might call the bedrock of an ethical theory. And so in the Euthyphro Dilemma, the special focus is on the desires of the gods. What do they desire? So that's the second point for the polytheists. The third point, for Plato and Aristotle as Greek dualists, For them, God is forming the world at best out of material that exists with God from eternity. So he doesn't, Peter used the word sovereignty. God does not have divine sovereignty. So when you read Plato or Aristotle and you see the word translated God, you get excited, oh, these guys believed in God, kind of like Moses. No, this is a very different conception of God. This is God co-eternal with matter, maybe the demiurge, or what you call the unmoved mover, if you've heard of this. For Aristotle, God is unmoved by the world. He moves things by being perfect, and things move towards that excellence or towards that perfection, but God himself is unaware of the world. He's involved in perfect self-contemplation. He doesn't know of anything else besides himself. So in Plato and Aristotle, this problem will come out very differently, and the object, the good, and God as being come out as, and Plato expressed them as the same thing, but they're really two different categories. We're asking about what is good. How do humans possess this thing? How do they get it? Like if you want a paycheck, you want to get your paycheck from your boss, right? So we don't get God in the way that we get a paycheck and put it in our pocket, have God with us. Instead, we get God by participating in the divine knowledge and knowing about who God is. And so we distinguish between God and knowing who God is. And that's the fourth point in theism. So you have the context for Socrates and Euthyphro, then the problem for a polytheist, the problem for a dualist, and fourth point, the problem for the theist. In theism, we have only God is eternal. Only God has existed from eternity. God determines the good for something by creating its nature. So the good is according to the nature of a thing. What is good for a human depends on what it is to be a human. What is good for a horse depends on what it is to be a horse. What is good for a car depends on what it is to be a car. You can keep going, right? Can you imagine taking your horse in for an oil change every 3,000 miles? Or neglecting to do so for your car because your horse doesn't need that? So when we speak about the good of something, there's sometimes the divine command theory says something's good because God says so. We have this middle term, the nature of a thing. What is it to be that thing? So that God does determine the good, but he does it through making the thing of a certain kind. Say a human is a rational being, and so knowledge is particularly good for rational beings. And then the fifth point, finally, back to this idea of piety. Euthyphro says he's pious. If you've read Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneas likes to go around saying the same thing. Sum pius Aeneas. I am pious Aeneas. But it's not really a phrase we say anymore, is it? I am pious Anderson. Could have that on my office door. I love God. I do what God says. The idea is if God commands it, I do it. Jupiter said, found Rome, I do that, no matter what other personal demands are on me. Well, in order to do this, we'd have to distinguish God from not God. If you love God, you'd need to know what God is and what isn't God. Does that seem like a fair place to begin? If you imagine that on a Valentine's Day card, you're not quite sure who you love. I love you, but I don't know who you are or what your nature is. On a Valentine's Day card, they want you to be very specific. Not only do you have two eyes, they're the best eyes ever, right? Not only do you have hair, it's the best hair ever, right? So to love God would be able to know God, to know what makes God distinct from not God. That would be the first step. And this will require us to be able to work our way through, are we polytheists, are we dualists, or are we theists? Is God a finite created being who has some greater power than us, but ultimately can be destroyed? Is God co-eternal with the material world? Or is God the creator? And that's the end. That's my 10 minutes. All right. Hope you have some good questions.
The last question would be, if you, being a Christian myself, we take God as being a perfect, take God as being a perfect individual or a perfect being. Some people say because of Jesus, he was both man and God. However, it's either human beings by themselves can be flawed or they can't be. If Jesus was a human being, whether he was part God or whatnot, he would also have to be subject to being flawed himself. And being flawed, doesn't that mean, but the Bible, because of its interpretation and because we weren't there ourselves and we don't understand the literal meaning of the Word of God, that it would be very hard to understand and comprehend what he literally was trying to tell us. I mean, we can allude to the fact of, yes, morally right, wrong, good, bad, thou shalt not kill, steal, things like that. But what his literal interpretation was interpreted by the only people who spoke the language at that time was Romans, and therefore had their own political agenda and influences that they wanted to get across. How do we know what is really being written was really transcribed by him, and whether or not he truly was flawed or unflawed? That's my last question. Thank you.
Briefly, I'm still thinking about the previous question. I didn't get a way in. But especially about Thomas Hobbes, I think what Hobbes is doing for us is pointing out the epistemology problem. So the epistemology problem is, how do we know if there is a prophet, or if it's a true or false prophet? Now, that just asking the question doesn't necessarily close the door to there being true prophets. There might be actual prophets. They might all be charlatans. But those are two separate questions, right? So how do we know? And then what does a prophet do? And I think that's we've been talking about value and ethics, the good, and then somewhat about relating that to being, which is ontology. But this is the third area, which is knowledge. How do we know what is good or what exists? And so I think that relates to this question too about scriptures. The question itself pushes us in a certain direction to say, are there scriptures? Are there accurate scriptures? How do we know the original meaning of the words being used? How do we know if they relate to our words today? There might be the case that we don't need scriptures at all. Part of what Euthyphro and Socrates are doing is they're not appealing to a text. And even when they do talk about the gods, they don't cite a chapter and verse of the Iliad or something. Part of the idea is that because we are rational beings, we can know that things have natures and things are beneficial or good or help something flourish. So it's not really a question about Scripture at all yet in that sense. That would take us kind of far afield, because Scripture presupposes a number of these things. It presupposes there is a God, there is something good, there is sin, human needs redemption. And I think part of why Peter is bringing this subject up is precisely because it gets to the heart of those questions. Before we can even build up to that, we have to first know what is good, what is God. And so then that's an epistemology question, really, right? How do we know these sorts of things? I think that would keep coming up for us. How do we gain knowledge? How do we have certainty versus just an opinion?
Right.
One thing that your question made me think about in this issue of necessity, and I was thinking the same thing about instrumental necessity or virtue, that something is useful for some goal. And this raises the question, there are different levels of goals, like building a house, and you talked about the four corners of the house to hold up the roof. And you build a house to stay out of the weather, and you want to stay out of the weather so you can be healthy and more productive. And so there are different levels of goals that come up in life. And that raises the question if there's a highest goal. And this is called in the literature the good. And so we've talked about the good in one way here, which is constrained by the Euthyphro discussion. And again, that discussion is an emotivist view of the good, which is something's good if it is desirable or it appeals to me. But another way of discussing the same term, the good, so it's the same word, but it's ambiguous, is that it's the highest goal. So you are aiming at this thing as an end in itself, not to get something else, and you may not even desire it on some days, but it's the highest goal, the end in itself, the good, the chief end of man. And so then you can use the language you're using to ask this question, what is this thing? What is the highest goal? Now, in my presentation, that was one of the things I was getting at, was that for humans, the highest goal is to know things, and not just anything, like how many times have the Red Sox won the World Series, but to know the highest being, and be able to know the details about the highest being, not just general kind of highest power. And so that's one of the things I think is highlighted by this whole dilemma is the word good. I tried to zero in on how the word God is used ambiguously in different worldviews, but also we've been using the word good ambiguously and tending to slip into the way Euthyphro was using it, which is that which is desirable. And then you get these problems. It doesn't come up the same way, the same issue if you're speaking about ends. And you could just stop using the word good and just talk about, what is your goal or end, and what is the highest end? What is the chief end? And I think the other thing about the Euthyphro dilemma is that there are different kinds of dilemmas in philosophy. Some dilemmas are both options lead to falsehoods. And so the starting point must also be false. And that's often what we do, like when we're going on the offensive against another worldview, we'll point out, well, if you believe this, you lead to this false conclusion. And if you go this direction, you lead to that false conclusion. So you can't start down this direction at all. But the Euthyphro Dilemma, as we've been presenting, is a little different, isn't it? We've been presenting it more like, here are two things, both of which have some problems, but neither of which is necessarily false. So Mike defended the fact that you do simply have brute facts about morality, and it may be fine to stop with God and say God is the origin of these things. But that's not quite the same as, someone could object to that and say, I'm not comfortable with that stopping point, but that's not quite the same as saying that's a false horn of dilemma. It's just two horns, and people maybe are uncomfortable with one or the other. And part of what I was talking about is the reasons why we're uncomfortable illustrate things about ourselves and our own prior commitments. So if I'm uncomfortable with stopping with God, or I'm uncomfortable with what seems to be arbitrary, that's an interesting thing. It kind of shows some of my own commitments. Why am I uncomfortable? What are my intuitions? And that's what philosophy does, right? Philosophy encourages us to lead the examined life, to get to know ourselves and what are my own beliefs, and why do I end up thinking this horn of the dilemma is less acceptable. I don't like the arbitrary side. I like the God as the foundational brute fact side. That's what's so interesting to me, what that says about us.